Hello, welcome to Portland Ovation's pre-performance lecture for Pacifica Quartet. I'm Sarah Coleman, the director of Ovations Offstage, and I'm going to start us off with a land acknowledgement. Portland Ovations acknowledges that the places where we gather, dance, and sing is ancestral Wabanaki land. We wish to pay respect to the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and their elders past, present, and future. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us for this virtual pre-performance lecture for the illustrious Pacifica Quartet, who are performing Wednesday, October 20th at 7 p.m. at Merrill Auditorium. If you are watching this before that date, tickets are still available and you can find them at portlandovations.org. And we want to thank the Onion Foundation for their support of Ovations Offstage. And now I am thrilled to introduce you all to our speaker, pianist George Lopez. George is a performer, an educator, and a lecturer, as well as Bowdoin College's Robert Beckwith Artist in Residence, where he initiated the beloved Music in the Museum series, and where he is joining us from now. So George has toured extensively across the US and Europe, and today his lecture is entitled The Helping Hands of Suffrage, Women in Classical Music. Welcome, George.
It's great to be here, Sarah. Thank you so much for that nice introduction. What a great opportunity that Portland Ovations has given me to address all of you, not just for this lecture, but to also be a part and have a hand in the development of a whole series of lectures for the Chamber Music Series at Ovations this season. Today we're going to talk about a really important and exciting piece of history, women in music, women in classical music particularly, and the Pacifica have put together a program inspired by the 100th anniversary year of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Yet not all women, which is also part of that history and important to discuss. We're going to open with a fantastic story about Ella and Marilyn as introduction to the helping hands of women's rights and women's advancement against great odds. A lot of people don't know this story, but when I discovered it years ago, I wanted to share this as an opening to our discussion today, where at the time Ella was making her career in the early part of the 20th century, mid-20th century, Black singers were really not allowed to perform in large venues. They mostly did small nightclubs in some of the major cities around the country, New York, Chicago, LA. And she wanted to tour California, Ella did, and was not allowed to sing at one of the biggest and best clubs in LA. Marilyn was an avid fan, having studied singing herself, where her vocal coach suggested to her that she listen to the recordings of Ella Fitzgerald to give her a good sense of how to sing songs from the Great American Songbook. So Marilyn was already a fan, and when she found out that Ella was not being let to sing in this club, she insisted. She called up the manager, and Ella tells this story in a letter. She says, "I owe Marilyn Monroe a real debt. She personally called the owner of the Macumbo in LA and told him she wanted me booked immediately, and that if he would, she'd take a front table every night. Because of her status, the press would go wild, she promised. The owner said yes, and Marilyn was there front table every night. The press went overboard. After that, I never had to play a small jazz club again. She was an unusual woman, a little ahead of her time, and she didn't know it." End quote, Ella. What a fantastic thing. And what we find is an evolving history of women's fearlessness, tenacity, perseverance in the face of extreme discrimination, which we'll see a very powerful picture of at the end of today's lecture. So moving on to our first composer in the lecture, I'm going to go chronologically through these composers' history, starting with the earliest composer and moving up through the final composer in the series. So we're going to start with Fanny Mendelssohn, who actually is going to end Pacifica's program on the 20th. Fanny Mendelssohn was an extraordinary, gifted pianist and ultimately composer. She and her brother Felix, the more known of the two, mainly because of the opportunities afforded him, were trained at home, taught by some of the best minds in Germany at the time. They both came from a very well-to-do family. Their father was a very successful banker, one of the most powerful actually in Germany and in Europe. And Fanny, of course, was more talented than Felix and also didn't have the support of her family. Interestingly, she writes later in life, "I am a woman like any other, reproached for one's miserable feminine nature every day. This could bring a person into a rage and consequently derive one of femininity, but that would make things even worse." As you can see in the slide, some of the notes, historical notes there, Fanny's own father, Abraham, was not keen on her following the life of a musician or a composer. Germany's laws at that time were as backward as anywhere in Europe or in the United States in terms of equality, both of women and of course of people of color. Remarkably, Fanny continued writing music, even though they were never published until after her father passed away. And I wanted to read to you also a very interesting quote, just to give you an idea of what Fanny's talent was really about. An English visitor to Germany who heard her in performance in 1830 writes, "I cannot refrain from mentioning Miss Mendelssohn's name. She's a first-rate pianist. She is no superficial musician. She has studied the science deeply and writes with the freedom of a master. Her songs are distinguished by tenderness, warmth, and originality. Some which I heard were exquisite." So Fanny was a very remarkable musician. She could play, as you will find in a later piece of history with Amy Beech, she could play all the preludes and fugues by Bach from memory, which is extraordinary. So Fanny is a real testament to pushing against extreme odds. Even her brother wasn't really fully in her corner, although he greatly respected her enough to constantly ask her advice about his own music. You will hear this wonderful 4-movement quartet that has so many harmonic surprises, beautiful dialogue between all of the instruments, as well as a fantastic romance, the 3rd movement, which is the most known movement of the set. So we really start with the most challenging circumstances in this program, with German law really being very far behind the times. And this was actually the period just before America started to boom in terms of women's rights, with Seneca Falls Convention happening in New York in 1848, which is just after she passed away. In our next trend toward independence of women, Amy Beech, often known as Mrs. H.H.A. Beech, taking on her husband's name after marriage, is one of the first significant trailblazers of women in classical music, in this case, in the United States. She wrote a symphony in response to Dvorak's claim that, as he says, "All the ladies play here. It's nice, but I'm afraid the ladies cannot help us much. They have not the creative power." Well, talk about sending you into a rage. She went into a rage, and as rebuttal, published in one of the Boston papers this retort: "From the year 1675 to the year 1885, women have composed 153 works, including 55 serious operas, 6 cantatas, 53 comic operas, 17 operettas, 4 ballets, and 2 oratorios, along with numerous other important works." Well, she was not to be trifled with, and went on to become one of the most respected musicians in America, woman or man. She was part of what became known as the Second New England School of Composition, the first being in the previous century, in the 1700s, with the advent of choral music in this country, starting with William Billings of England, who came here. But this second school, which included all men save Amy Beech, who, as you can see in the quote in this slide, "I'm pleased that an American and a woman can produce such strong and beautiful musical ideas. You are now one of the boys," George Chadwick, who sort of was the head of this particular group of composers. I think the thing that really amazed me is in this first note on the slide, you'll see she played not only all the preludes and fugues by Bach, but as a teenager, she could play them from memory in any key. That's a very rare gift. So Amy Beech, being a real trailblazer, she was commissioned to write a festival overture for the World's Fair in Chicago, and in fact was initially denied entry into that until a woman raised money essentially to build an entire building just for women's events. It was known as the Women's Building of the Chicago World's Fair. And in that building was celebrated all things that women could do, composing and writing and art and dance. And it was an extraordinary exposition. So Amy Beech's work was brought in and demonstrated. And I love the fact that she took the royalties from the publication of that work to buy herself a house in Cape Cod as a vacation home. I also wanted to share with you Amy Beech's ideas about music. So as we move to the next slide, we see that she writes a letter as part of a magazine for musicians in November of 1918, so this is just after World War I, where she says to some young girl who wants to become a musician, "We cannot know, except in rare instances, from exactly what source we derive our inspiration. Composers influence in as many ways as there are composers. Some haven't been influenced at once by some tremendous happening in their lives or in the world around them, and have been able to burst forth with some musical utterance that was directly the result of circumstances. Another composer might remain apparently unaffected by even the most terrific onslaught upon all that was deepest in his life, and years afterward give expression in music, perhaps unconsciously, to all that the experience had cost him." I share this because Amy Beech was very, very well educated, mostly by herself as a musician, extremely well read. She was interested in so many topics in science, in the arts and literature. She was fully aware of the contemporary research of how music was experienced in other cultures. And it's important to note that the quartet that you will hear in parts, but played as a single movement, uses Alaskan Inuit folk music as part of its inspiration. I'm sure the quartet will address this during the concert, as well as the program notes written by Melissa Reardon, director of the Portland Chamber Music Festival, who you will read once you arrive at the concert. And part of what we're doing is trying to complement with this virtual lecture, with the program notes, and with the spontaneous lecture given on stage during the concert, to give you a fuller immersion into the history of this. At this point, I'd like to step away from our slides and talk for a moment about narrativity in music, or this talking ability that music has. I had an aha moment in college as I was about to graduate, that because instrumental music, or music without words, essentially is improvised melodies that were originally used in folk songs, in arias, in oratorios, in the early part of the advent of classical music, 15th century, 16th century, that instrumental music, by its nature, has this ability to communicate certain ideas if you're aware of them. So, for example, I often use this famous melody as an example of, since we're opening our lecture with a German composer, This is a famous Lutheran hymn that Bach used in his famous Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. He takes this basic hymn and he improvises around the tune. Within that beautiful melody exists the tune. So instrumental music is essentially an ornate version of a more fundamental underlying melody. Most of what we hear can be stripped down into a very simple line, and this is a great example of that. There are many other great examples of how music is simple things are taken and ornamented. For example, take an A minor chord. If you trill the top note, you do a turn around the middle note, modify it, and then use the last note as the final cadential note, the cadence we call it. You get this. There are very few people who don't know that famous tune by Beethoven. So that just as an example of how instrumental music has as its origins able to communicate ideas if you're aware of them. So I wanted to bring out that narrative quality because in all of these works, there is that sense of wanting to communicate ideas through the rise and fall of melody, through the intensification of chords and harmony. Of course, dynamics are a big part of the intensity and sense of repose in music in general. So definitely be sure to listen to more than just the rhythm, which we tend to latch onto. It's the most obvious experience we have in music is the beat, and you'll hear that. But there are other elements. Notice the speech-like quality of some of the melodies that you'll hear throughout the opening of the concert. Now, getting back to our discussion of composers and getting back to our presentation in the slides, Florence Price, the first American female Black composer to have her work performed by a major orchestra, she was extraordinary. And I think it's important to note that often she is called a forgotten or lost composer. But the truth is that there were a number of musicians in our culture, in our country, that did not forget Florence Price, who continued playing her music. But it was mostly the major orchestras and the major conductors of this country and others that neglected her music. She was remembered, and there was a particularly important thing that happened, as you can see in the third note on this slide. I guess her family had had a country home and it was left abandoned after they left the area. So in 2009, it turns out two people wanted to refurbish this home. They bought the property and they discovered an old dusty box of handwritten music that turns out to be over 200 works by Florence Price, many of which could have been lost forever. So this was brought to the attention of her family, who then gave it to the University of Arkansas, where it sits in their archives. She was very prolific. And if you can imagine, not only being a woman, being Black in the South, she grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas. And she, among just a few others in that town, had some privilege. Her father was a dentist, mother was a musician herself and teacher. So she was able to access education and music, as well as being the place where many important Black intellectuals came, including W.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass, a very old Frederick Douglass, when she was a child. She went on to move to Chicago. Her family left Chicago, she, her husband, and 3 children, because of the violence that was going on in Chicago at that time against African Americans. She had a very rich experience in Chicago, being part of what's called the Chicago Black Renaissance, a Renaissance that was much longer and equally vibrant as the Harlem Renaissance that has a lot more renown. The crash made it very difficult, and during the Great Depression, she ultimately divorced from her husband, who had lost his job, and was on her own. At that point, she moves in with two of her children to the home of Margaret Bonds. At the time, this other wonderfully important and great African-American female composer, Margaret Bonds, was a child, and Florence sort of took her under her wing. Living in that home allowed her introduction to some of the great African-American artists of the time, particularly Marion Anderson, the great alto, and Langston Hughes, the poet, who at that time was in New York. Very interestingly, Florence Price wrote 50+ arias and songs for Marion Anderson, who, like Ella in a similar period, had difficulty singing in some of the more important venues. And you might recall that upon being denied a recital in one of the important halls in Washington, D.C., Eleanor Roosevelt, the then First Lady, left the organization that denied Marion Anderson a performance. They then put the concert in another hall, and one of the important songs that were sung was a song that Florence Price had composed for Marion Anderson at the Lincoln Memorial, with 75,000 people watching, and it's recorded, of course, on the radio. So this was a significant moment for Florence. She writes to Koussevitzky, the great composer of Boston Symphony at the time, in 1943. She says, "Unfortunately, the work of a woman composer is preconceived by many to be light, frothy, lacking in depth, logic, and virility. Add to that the incident of race. I have colored blood in my veins, and you will understand some of the difficulties that confronts me in such a position." Now, Koussevitzky didn't give her the time of day and didn't respond to her letter, but she very much advocated strongly throughout her life to have her works performed. She was a great performer herself, making her living both as a composer, pianist, organist, and teacher. And eventually, after her passing, 10 years after that letter in 1953, her work was known only to the Black community in some major cities. The major orchestras and important venues really didn't pay attention to this music at all. And it was in this revival and this discovery of her work in 2009 that we find her music being investigated and brought out once again. So she was another important trailblazer that we really should celebrate more often. Looking ahead now, we have to move to our modern times where classical music is still very vibrant, with Shulamit Ron, Israeli-born composer, won the Pulitzer Prize for Music in 1991, was commissioned to write this work by the Pacifica Quartet back in 2014 not to commemorate anything particularly, but they were interested in works by women composers inspired by the visual arts, and particularly visual arts between the wars. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the history of women's rights in Israel as part of this suffrage theme that Pacifica has brought to their program. So in the late 1800s, Israeli women, they wanted to be treated as equals, and particularly in the areas of agriculture, being able to both work on and own property, farm property, and also access to labor unions. It wasn't until 1927, 7 years after women's right to vote in this country became legal, 1927, that Israeli women won the right to both vote and hold office. During Shulamit's lifetime, issues around the treatment of girls within family life, breaking down barriers in religious life, participation in public rituals, and having more leadership in the political sphere have made some headway, but there's still challenges. Of course, Golda Meir was a significant figure in that development and progress. Again, I'd like to have the composer heard in her own words to talk about this very important piece inspired by a painter. So let me read to you the program notes that Shulamit Ron gave to us about her work, Glitter, Doom, Shards, Memory. For the first movement, titled That Which Happened, Das Wach, or rather Das was gesagt in German, is how the poet Paul Celan referred to the Shoah, or the Holocaust. These simple words served for me in the first movement as a metaphor for the way in which ordinary life, with its daily flow and its sense of sweet normalcy, was shockingly, inhumanely, inextricably shattered. Second movement, called Menace, is a shorter movement mimicking a scherzo. It's also very machine-like, incessant, with an occasional recurring waltz-like little tune. Perhaps the chilling grimace we recognize from the executioner's guillotine mask. Like the death machine it alludes to, it gathers momentum as it goes and is unstoppable. Well, I'm looking forward to that second movement. That sounds powerful and quite an experience. In the third movement, If I Perish, Do Not Let My Paintings Die, these words are by Felix Nussbaum, who, knowing what was ahead, nonetheless continued painting till his death in Auschwitz in 1944. So this movement refers directly to the artist whose life and works inspired this string quartet by Shulamit Ran. Felix Nussbaum, who we'll get to in a moment, died in Auschwitz really almost at the end of the war, and was an incredible artist as part of the Verists, or the realist commentators through art on German society during what's known as the Weimar period, 1919 to 1933. There was a level of decadence in that period of time, particularly in Berlin, that was unseen prior. Very much what was happening in France during this same period, the Golden Age, as we call it. The fourth movement, called Shards and Memory, she says, is a direct reference to my quartet's title. Only shards are left, and memory. The memories of things large and small, of unspeakable tragedy, but also of the song and the dance, the smile, the hopes, all things human. As we remember, in the face of death's silence, we restore dignity to those who are gone. That's going to be quite an extraordinary performance. And I want you to notice, as you listen to this very edgy, exciting, exquisite in many places piece, notice the communication between the performers, which is so much a part of great chamber music making, and Pacifica will deliver that in spades. A great quartet who really worked with the composer on this piece. So they have a particularly intimate knowledge and experience with the work. So I hope you enjoy their dialogue with each other, which is part of the experience of listening to this music. In our final discussion, which is actually, I believe, the fourth work on the program, either the third work on the program, which we'll get to in a moment, because I did want you to see this slide on the artist whose self-portrait on the left you'll see there is his holding his Jewish identity card, with which all Jews had to hold and keep on them in Germany during World War II. As I mentioned, he's part of the Verist composers and the whole idea of rejecting the idealization of reality. These Verist, they created really harsh, sort of the reality and the macabre version of what was going on in Germany at the time. And finally, this idea of holding, in their paintings, holding society up to a mirror to show, yes, on the one hand, the glitter, and on the other hand, sort of the doomed nature of so many artists and people of that period. To the right of the slide, you'll see the title of the original book that the Met put out for their exhibit in 2006 and 2007 about this. This is the exhibition that inspired Shulamit Ran, her work, Glitter, Doom, Shards, Memory. And I wanted to include a very powerful painting of Felix Nussbaum in the upper corner there, titled Fear, and that is himself and his niece, in a photograph during the war. I'm sorry, not a photograph, a painting. Finally, we'll end our discussion of this with Jennifer Higdon's work. She is a living composer trained at the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia, and during her final year there as she was graduating, wrote this work in 1933 as her dissertation piece. And it got picked up a few years later by the Pacifica, who played it all over the world in their programs. And so Jennifer decided to rededicate the work to them. And she has since written other works for them as well. But it's like all the other works on this program, it has a personal voice, every pun intended. She's trying to communicate qualities, moods, and in her program notes, she actually uses the term image to describe each movement. So there are 3 parts to her quartet, and she says the first image, Blitz, title, carries a tremendous amount of relentless, frenzied energy. It describes a high level of intensity, always on the verge of explosion. So what's significant here is she's referring exactly to World War II and the German blitzkriegs that were happening throughout Europe at the time. So a wonderful sort of link to Shulamit Ron's work as well. She goes on to say the second image or second movement, called Soft Enlacing, I love that, carries a much more vague meaning and is a calming contrast from the first movement. It may be very much like a walk through the house in the middle of the night, shadows, while the floor feels solid underfoot, the rest of the world to the eyes and ears seems to be moving shadows. It may also be a gentle hug or a warm emotional embrace of a loved one. Again, its image is not meant to be clear-cut and depends upon the listener's viewing. What a wonderful way to sort of open the landscape to your own imagination as a listener and experience it as you will in the moment rather than latching on just to the image that she offers. Those are usually reference points, starting points, springboards, if you will, into engaging not only your ears, but your imagination and whatever else comes up for you as you listen through the work. But truly engaging this piece is going to be very important for your experience, as opposed to, rejecting it because it sounds maybe unfamiliar. She has put a lot of meaning into this work and considered it very greatly. As she says in the final movement, called Grace, this is the calmest and carries the most possible number of meanings. The giving of thanks at a meal, the grace seen in behavior or in a personality, the grace of movement, the bestowing of oneself unto others, the quiet presence that exists in a being's soul. The telling of these images is from manic and frenzied to calm and quiet, from specific to vague, and dark to light. So here, one of the things she was experimenting with, as she says in an interview, most works start with less and build to more as they climax toward their completion. In this piece, she reverses that and starts with mayhem and chaos in the first Blitz movement, and then gradually moves toward something that's more peaceful, more relaxed, more, as she says, embracing. So that will be a wonderful experience for you to pay attention to within yourself as you sit and listen to her wonderful, wonderful quartet. To conclude, I want to bring your attention to a story in this next slide. Catherine Switzer, what an extraordinary woman. She was a college student at Syracuse University back in the late 60s and was on the track team. And she said to her coach that she wanted to run a marathon. Well, he said that most women don't really have the stamina to do that, but that if she could run it at college, he would accompany her to the Boston Marathon to run the great race in Boston. So she did it, and they went to the Boston Marathon in 1967. Because she used only her initials for her entry application, the commission didn't realize she was a woman. She got there, she got her number. She had lots of cheerleaders at the marathon egging her on. I guess there was a film truck that one of the commissioners was on the back of. And during the race, as they were filming it, he observed that she was running, jumped off of the truck, and tried to get her out of the race, pulling on her shirt, ripping part of her numbers off, knocking her coach out of the way. And in this wonderful photo, if you can see here, her boyfriend, who is an ex-football player, knocks the commissioner essentially off the road into the grass to stop him from keeping her from running. She then went on to finish the Boston Marathon, but yet it would still be another 4 or 5 years before they would allow women to officially run in the race. There was another woman that day who ran that race, but wasn't talked about because of this very famous incident that happened with Catherine. Catherine went on and still runs marathons even now. You can see her photo there as in a contemporary setting. And I particularly love this story because it shows, again, the tenacity and perseverance that these women demonstrated in the face of great discrimination and obstacles. This program, inspired by Suffrage, is an inspiration really for all of us. I myself grew up in a family of women with my mother, my grandmother, my sister, and just have the utmost respect and honor for all the great women that have forged ahead and created opportunity for themselves and for those in the next generation as well. I want to thank you for listening to this opening lecture of our series here at Portland Ovations. I'd like to thank Sarah Coleman, Katie Day for their assistance in organizing and producing this event. And I look forward to introducing you to some other speakers as well in future lectures, whether virtually or in person here in Portland. Just have a wonderful time at the concert. Allow this lecture, as well as reading the program notes upon arrival, as well as engaging every note that you hear, to give you a fuller experience. The whole idea of these lectures is to immerse you into a broader world of the program and of each work. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Thank you, George. Thank you so much. I really am just thinking about everything that you shared and thinking a lot about how deliberately you were able to talk about that women weren't absent in our history of music. They just were intentionally dismissed or restricted or ignored, and that's also in how we know the history of it as well. So I just appreciate that. So I wanted to take a moment to ask if you wanted to speak a little bit more about our partnership over the coming year. We are so thrilled to be working with you for this season across all of our chamber music performances to curate these pre-performance lectures and think about the connection between the program notes, as you mentioned. And I'm wondering if you wanted to share a little bit about what you're planning or just tease something to come.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, this is such an exciting venture, and I will be infinitely grateful to Sarah and the director of Portland Ovations, Amy, for giving me this opportunity to be creative and create something that's a little different than what you normally do. Usually you arrive, there are program notes, sometimes the artist will say something, but this is an opportunity for us to really do a deep dive, not only into the musical works, but what their inspirations were, what was going on at the time, what's the inspiration behind the program for the artists who are performing, which I think just draws us in to the web of creation on all levels. So we're going to be looking at guest speakers coming in who I'll be working with behind the scenes to create these very rich, broad landscaped lectures on each program. We'll have a piano soloist, we'll have another quartet at the end of the season, and then a super interesting group, Sphinx Virtuosi, who is going to bring in, they're going to bring in lesser known works and opportunities to see what's happening in both the Black, Latino, and other more marginalized repertoires. So it's a great opportunity for us to broaden our understanding of music and sort of bring back in an archaeological way what people at that time, so we're talking anything from the late 1700s, mid 1800s, into the 20th century and into our times, to bring back what was part of a literate culture of music. So I'm really excited to bring all of these ideas to you throughout the season. So definitely look out for those on the Portland Ovations website.
Thank you. Well, thank you, George, and thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at an Ovations event in the future.